When we asked developers who do they think should own security for their application, 81% of them said developers should own that. The DevOps thing is kind of empowering developers to own their infrastructure. So as they take more ownership around security, that's kind of the good security posture that you want developers to have when they build applications. When we asked maintainers, how do they find out about vulnerabilities, half of them find out about it when other people are opening public issues on the project. There's a good intention, but not enough action on it to mitigate the security problems.
Hi, I'm Guy Pojarny, CEO and co-founder of Snyk, and you're listening to The Secure Developer, a podcast about security for developers, covering security tools and practices you can and should adopt into your development workflow. It is a part of the Secure Developer community. Check out thesecuredeveloper.com for great talks and content about developer security and to ask questions and share your knowledge. The Secure Developer is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we have Liran Tal joining us here. Welcome, Liran.
Hey, Guy. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thanks for coming on the show. So we have a lot of topics. We have a data-packed element here. Liran, you work at Snyk here, right? And you ran a couple of security reports we're going to talk about.
Indeed.
These are the state of open source security, talking about open source security as a whole, and then one on Docker security, right? Mm-hmm. So before we dig into sort of the details, I guess, on those, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this wonderful world of security?
I guess I've been doing that since an early age. So security has been a large part of my life since then. From the early days of 2600 and, on RC channels and stuff like that, I've been kind of running my own BBS and, just getting, acquainted with the digital world at that point in time. So been doing that for a while. And then I think in the last maybe couple of years, I've been diving more into node-specific security. I managed to write a book about it, kind of put a lot of best practices and guidelines for developers, how to secure their node applications. And, a lot of DOT and OWASP involvement and stuff like that got me into working as a full-time helping secure the system at Snyk.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, that's basically go from nerding out on the on the infrastructure to sort of getting to securing the apps on it. Cool.
Yep.
Let's dig into the report. So, first of all, we're talking about these two sort of state of X security type of reports. What's the motivation for doing these types of reports in the first place? Why bother?
Right. So a lot about it is just exposing this information out. So sharing a lot of those insights and, just exploring the state of the ecosystem around security. And a lot about the report. Actually, the stuff that I really like about it is it really covers kind of a 360 kind of the ecosystem. So it's not just focusing on application libraries or operating system. It's combining all of those different data points by surveying people and asking them questions, maintainers and developers about their practices in security. So a lot about it is kind of measuring the state of, the security in open source ecosystems and communities, and of course the software that we have. And everyone are building software based on open source kind of. So you can't run away from it, and it's good once we have the visibility into what's going on there.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of a lot to unpack there. So, one aspect is, you can't optimize what you can't measure, I guess, right?
True.
So if we put some measurement on it, then we're able to maybe make it better. Have you indeed seen much conversations that flowed from those conversations, from the stats that were published?
Right. So I think the Docker stats really surprised a lot of people. The idea, the notion that people are surprised by the amount of vulnerabilities they are shipping with their Docker containers to production is something that I think really hit a virality point around social media, because people were really surprised about the amount of vulnerabilities present in their Docker images, what they build their containers on. And that really made a good hit.
Cool. Yeah, and I guess this is kind of a bit of a recurring theme on this show, which is the importance of visibility and security, right? Security is naturally invisible. So doing things that just raises it a little bit to your awareness, the fact that there is a security concern, right? Or let alone a security breach,
right,
is kind of worthy of highlighting. So let's kind of switch into the actual report. So first of all, how did we kind of get to this point, right? What data got collected? How were the reports kind of built up and structured?
Yeah, so we looked at different data sets. One of them is the data elements of it are basically looking at Snyk-related data from customers and all the users that we have, scanning how, looking at how people or developers actually use software in their projects. How many of that is vulnerable? What is their kind of versioning schemes around it? We also looked at just open source repositories, things like the ecosystems, the registries, GitHub-related data itself. And lastly, had a human element into it, which asking several hundred people in a survey what is their security posture around open source security specifically. So kind of trying to measure a lot of the human element and blend that with the data that we collected.
Do you find was the data fairly consistent? Were there sort of discrepancies between the data that we saw and the answers people said?
Not really a lot of those. The general trend being, that there's a uprising trend in terms of, more vulnerabilities that we find in open source libraries, in terms of, application libraries, operating system libraries. The trend is just up, meaning we are finding more and more each over year vulnerabilities in the ecosystem. There's an interesting trend around the survey itself, whereas developers or maintainers state, that they want to own security, and on average, maintainers have 6.6 out of 10 skill level of security, and that sounds like a medium, but that's fairly high to rate yourself on an average. And then at the same time, when we asked maintainers on how did they find out about vulnerabilities, half of them kind of find out about it when other people are opening public issues on the project. So there's kind of, the effect of maybe people rate themselves as having a high security knowledge, but at the same time, they don't really find out about the vulnerabilities themselves, right?
Yeah, the actions don't necessarily speak for that. Well, I guess we start with good intent and then and then we proceed from there.
True.
Okay, so interesting, and sort of putting aside the fact that we as humans are pretty lousy at sort of assessing our skill levels. We have these data sources. So you run the survey, you ran the analysis on a bunch of data. You collected some data from Snyk usage and collected all of those into these two reports. So I know the reports are fairly kind of intermixed a little bit in the data or maybe the insights that they have, but let's still try to kind of break them apart. Let's start with this state of open source security report. What are the sort of key insights? We're not going to go through the full data set from there, but give us a highlight or three.
Sure. So I think, as you said, open source software maintainers, they have good intent, but they're not well equipped to handle it. So they need a little help with tooling, and stuff like that to help them raise this stuff. So some highlights, for example, only 30% of maintainers we asked say they have a high level of security knowledge. And as we said before, only half of them just find out about issues when users are opening security issues for their repositories. So, there's kind of a discrepancy there between how users kind of rate themselves to what really happens. If you think about it, when we asked, maintainers, how do they audit, their code bases, to leverage information about vulnerabilities, to expose it. So, 1 in 4 maintainers don't even audit their code bases. And, that's truly a high number. So just, go through your package JSON or whatever project, count, 1 out of 4 dependencies, that's probably didn't go through a security review, through a security audit, code review best practices and stuff like that. So that's kind of virtually not even there. It's a bit of a terrifying stat to have. I think especially in terms of the tooling that we have in the ecosystem, specifically for Snyk, that makes it really easy to find those vulnerabilities. We'd want to see, more people, just leverage the kind of developer-friendly tooling that we have to raise those. Yeah,
it's a scary stat, and yet somehow not entirely unexpected, right? It's great to see maintainers care about it, but we have such high expectations from open source maintainers. When you build almost single-handedly or like a very small group, you build a piece of software that gets downloaded millions and millions of times a month, then the bar is kind of high, like your impact, you're doing a lot of good, but that also means that the responsibility on your shoulders is pretty heavy. So it's good to sort of see the intent there, but it's indeed a little unsettling sort of hear about security practices not necessarily being there.
Yeah, it's good you mentioned, we're going back to the intent part, because I think the positive or, the optimistic stats to take out of it is, when we asked developers who do they think should own security, for their application, 81% of them said, developers should own that. And I think that's a really good trend. That's really high number in terms of the statistics, and showing that I feel that full stack development kind of, at least that terminology kind of brought with itself a lot of responsibility into developers, meaning they don't just focus on front end. Now we have the full stack, so it's front end and then back end. The DevOps thing is kind of empowering developers to own their infrastructure. So by product, a lot of those abstractions and software, like owning like a Docker file, but not the actual infrastructure, allows developers to take more ownership. So as they take more ownership around security, that's great. That's kind of the good security posture that you want developers to have when they build applications. Just have that mindset.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I guess you have to start there, right? Otherwise, nothing will happen. So that's kind of insight one. On the maintainer side, sounds like maintainers are well intentioned. They do accept that them as maintainers and as developers should own this responsibility. They potentially slightly overrate their sort of security skills, but still, like a bunch of them, only about 3 in 10, if I understood correctly, rated as high. And hopefully over time, we see improvement there. We did have Martin Mikos from HackerOne on the show talking about the internet bug bounty, which I guess, maybe they can use those.
Yep.
And I believe in last year's report, there were a bunch of these examples and recommendations, probably repeated this year, around having a disclosure policy and the likes. So
Sure.
I guess do check out the report for concrete advice as a maintainer on what you can do.
Maintainers and developers.
Yeah, maintainers and developers as a whole. So indeed, let's kind of shift a little bit. So this is like, a highlight of insight on the maintainer side. What about the consumer side? What have we learned? What did you find out on the consumer side?
I think as developers, we try to gain insights into, once developers, develop their apps, they have a lot of CI infrastructure to, run tests, run accessibility, stuff like that. An important part of that is, being able to address security as well, and CI, shifting security to the left, kind of trying to raise vulnerabilities much sooner than finding out about them as in production or, God forbid, as a data breach. So one of the questions were, whether security testing is being used in CI. 37% of developers, are not even at all using any kind of security testing during their CI. We also asked about Docker images scanning, for example, out of which, only 14% of developers said they actually do Docker scanning.
14%?
14%, yes. So it's a fairly low amount.
Yeah.
I think it correlates a little bit with the ownership that developers have around DevOps. So as in, they haven't truly, embraced the idea of, owning the DevOps pipeline, Docker file, managing that. And even if they have good intentions of, owning that, there isn't yet enough visibility around what that entails in terms of, security risks and stuff like that. Another interesting information is, as we have asked them about, how do they find out about vulnerabilities in general in their CI, not just about scanning, is, we learned that 36% of users use a dependency management tool, to handle scanning, which is, fairly good amount of that. Yet, 27% of them have no automatic or, proactive way of raising the information around vulnerabilities. So basically, there's still a large amount of users that, even though tooling exists to help them find out about vulnerabilities and CI, that they're not really using any kind of that in their CIs.
Yeah, interesting. So basically, like only about 1 in 4. I guess if a new struts vulnerability, sort of pick on the infamous struts vulnerability, right? A new one of those, or I guess it was actually recently a jQuery one that came out. Only about 1 in 4 developers would automatically be notified about one of those, and I guess a bunch of others would either not know about it or would have to do some proactive exploration to find that out.
True.
What about the data bit? I know one of the aspects in the reports talked about when you consume open source, most of the vulnerabilities came not through the libraries you consumed, but rather indirectly. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's indeed a really interesting insights that we were able to figure out. And that is, as you develop, there are dependencies, libraries that you directly consume, directly use in your app. But, to the nature of open source, those libraries maybe are built, on other libraries that other people have written. And out of that, we were able to conclude, out of data that Snyk has on users, scanning their projects, we're seeing an interesting trend where most of the vulnerabilities are not coming from the libraries that you're explicitly using, but those indirect dependencies that they're bringing with them. So for NPM, for example, I think that percentage is around 75, 78%. So meaning, as Snyk detects vulnerabilities for NPM projects, at 78% of the times, it's going to find it, in like nested dependencies, right? On indirect dependencies that you didn't explicitly bring into your project, but they got brought in by other dependencies, through the dependency chain.
Yeah.
That's kind of, a worry around managing dependencies in general.
Yeah, you have to dig deep,
True.
That is indeed, I guess we talked about the high bar for maintainers, but, we kind of expect us developers to sort of do a fair bit as well. So not only do you need to care about the, dozen or so libraries that you put in your package.json file or your POM.xml, actually those vulnerabilities in those would only account for, again, every fourth vulnerability that might be disclosed. You really, 3 out of those 4 would be in libraries that you never really ever ask for.
Sure.
It's libraries that those...
Are just coming in.
Yeah, that those libraries in turn pulled in. I'm a little bit biased here, but I'd sort of say a little bit of the realm of the tools. Okay, so on the consumption side, we have the sort of insight from the data side around vulnerabilities coming more from indirect. We have it seems like not a terrible but highly exciting amount of CI security testing, a little bit more daunting in the Docker security side. Mm-hmm. Maybe indeed let's kind of use this as a bit of an opportunity to shift to the Docker security report. Before we move off, if somebody wants to read the full set of data for the state of open source security, where should they go?
So it's on snyk.io/state of OS security.
Okay, cool. So let's switch to this Docker specific insight. So, you took this data, you collected, or you took the survey data, you took some additional analysis of data, and you released this state of Docker security report, or really container security, I imagine. Tell us what were the key learnings from there? You already alluded to a couple from the broader report, but what else have you learned?
True. Vulnerabilities-wise, we just scanned through 10 of the top most popular images on Docker Hub, which is a fairly popular kind of central place to find your Docker images. Yeah. And so we went through that, just going by the amount of popularity of images, took the top 10, scanned all of them, their default tags for that. Which is what people intend to use. And, we found out that, for each of them, every one of those top 10, they include at least 30 vulnerabilities, inside them when you use that.
But just to sort of, echo that back, so every single one of the top 10 had at least 30 vulnerabilities on it.
Yeah.
How come? Like, why? Well, like, these are the top 10 most popular images on Docker Hub.
Yes.
Why would they not have 0 vulnerabilities on them?
It's a really good question. So choosing a base image is a crucial part of building your Docker containers on. So as we're learning, simply Docker images built, themselves, they have a lot of vulnerabilities inside them, right? So these could be, general purpose images. For example, the node image has a little bit more than 30 vulnerabilities, something like 580.
Ouch.
Just a bit more.
Yeah.
It hurts me as I'm a node guy, but...
Yeah. Well, if I'm not mistaken, you're also on the node security working group.
True.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get that, of course, solved, but... The raw stats are that, as you scan the default node tag, it's bringing 580 or something like that, amount of vulnerabilities inside them. And, that's true, the idea that the base image, the kind of the default layer that the image is built upon, bringing with it a lot of libraries and tools, compilation headers, tools that you may not need. And that's kind of leaking back or dropping into your base image for whatever app you're building, because as kind of a default thing for you to do is build your app and start a Docker file with from node :10 or something like that. And this is where I think visibility is coming into play. You're not really understanding, or people may not be truly aware of what they're bringing in when they're doing like something like a from node 10. And they're bringing in a default image that has, over 500 vulnerabilities.
So it's interesting. You're kind of describing a bit of a Russian doll of these base images elements. So on one hand, the fact that these top images have vulnerabilities is something you as a consumer of those base images should know. Like you're probably pulling down a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. You should know what's there and address it. But you're also saying that those base images themselves, one of their key reasons for being vulnerable is because they in turn use other base images that also have vulnerabilities?
Yeah, true.
Is that how we got to that sort of 580 number in Node world?
Indeed. As a technical part of that, the Node one is built on a popular image that's called build pack depths. That's basically an image that is intended to build other base images upon. So it's kind of something that gives you a collection of cross-compilation headers. You can go and do npm install or pip install or gem bundle, whatever. You can do all of that by default. And the idea is to kind of give you an out-of-the-box good experience when you build a base image. So all of these tools kind of work seamlessly. You don't need to install anything else. And as it turns out, Node, the default Node image at least, is based on this distro, which is Debian-based and brings with it all of this, all of this goodness of tools, but at the same time, a lot of vulnerabilities that, are pulled into them as well. So there are better choices, in building base images that, we could make.
What are those, for instance? So kind of two questions come to mind, right? Mm-hmm. One is, what do I do, right? I still want to use Docker. I still want to use Node. Felt like Node, using the Node-based image sort of, appears to be a fairly reasonable decision. Mm-hmm. How do I kind of help myself out here a little bit? And then maybe like a related question is, are there examples of base images that do it well, right? That maybe, dare I say, even get it down to zero?
Right. So some considerations that you could do is, try to see which tag brings with it lesser vulnerabilities, meaning, there's Node 10, but then there's a collection of tags that exist in this Docker repository, so to say, that you can pick and choose, kind of like cherry picking your own specific flavor of the OS that Node is running on. So for example, if you were to choose Node 10 Jesse, you would get this amount of vulnerabilities. But if you would choose, Node 10 Seed or maybe even Alpine, you would get lesser vulnerabilities simply because those base images are built differently in terms of the dependencies and, the libraries that exist in them.
Okay, cool. So for step one is just choose the variant of your base image that suits you best. Yeah, choose wisely indeed. How do I find out how many vulnerabilities, each of those images?
So you have it in the report, and you can use a tool to scan Docker images. So Snyk is a way to scan your Docker images, allows you to get this visibility into the amount of vulnerabilities you have across the image, even give you an idea of which other very similar base images that you can choose based on what you have, but like just different tags that would allow you to just choose and use a different one that has lower vulnerabilities count. So it could be a smaller change for you to make, or major one depending on your preference of both mediating the risk as well as making sure that your application actually doesn't break and runs well.
Cool. And I think Docker Hub kind of gives you some stats about vulnerabilities as well, right? So that's when you sort of scan. So Snyk would sort of show you the specific, hey, you're using whatever node, you can switch to Node Alpine. That would reduce your vulnerabilities to so-and-so. But then also Docker Hub itself would at least show you, if you browse around, it's kind of a bit more manual, but if you browse around, you can also sort of see some of this data on the hub itself.
Yeah, they do expose some of that as well. Cool. I'm happy you're bringing this up because there is, however, an interesting aspect of that, and that is, containers, long-living containers and stuff like that. So let's talk about it a bit because it kind of relates to the visibility of data. So if you go, and, scan your Docker image, see that it has maybe zero vulnerabilities, maybe, or a low amount of them, and you're good with that, you're shipping that out. That's just one aspect of mitigating the risk. The thing is, if you're just using that Docker image in production, you deploy it, it's running there for a week or two, and during that time, a new vulnerability surfaces, that affect tools or libraries in that base image, you may not have the visibility into that. So kind of some key takeaways around Docker images is, if you can, rebuild that image, often, meaning, monitor it, see that there aren't any new vulnerabilities surfacing on that specific image tag that you're using. As you do that continuously, you are going to release new containers, into your production environment that have less and less vulnerabilities, So we are not only releasing, containers due to tests and fixes, or features that we develop, but also due to the idea of lowering the attack surface due to vulnerabilities that we want to mitigate against. So one key takeaway is definitely, scan your Docker images that you have in production, in development throughout the lifecycle, and then be able to deploy a new version that you can rebuild the image upon.
Okay, so this is, and kind of quoting some stats from the report, correct me if I'm wrong here. So like one is we talked about sort of choosing the stats from the report, talk about the vulnerable images, kind of select wisely, using the tools at your disposal. Two is rebuilding often, which would get rid of, like how often was it that if a vulnerability was found, it can be fixed by a rebuild?
So like 20% of the vulnerable Docker images can be fixed by a rebuild. That's what we found. So you could just mitigate that by rebuilding the image.
It's amazing. It's probably a topic for a whole conversation on its own. It actually is a topic for many outside security about the non-determinism of Docker builds. But sounds like a pretty high ROI that if you just rebuild often, you can fix 20% of the vulnerabilities that you encounter.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So that's sort of a second takeaway. And I guess kind of a third was to scan in the first place.
Yeah, right. So obviously, try and scan in the first place. I think we're seeing kind of a positive trend from the survey around Docker images as well, as we've seen around, developers embracing security. So just as a stat out around it, 68% of developers, believe that they should be responsible for container security. So that's, good positive trend all around. Yet 50% of those, don't scan their OS layers for vulnerabilities. So kind of the same conflict in terms of, there's a good intention, but not enough action on it to mitigate the security problems.
Yeah, I mean, to me, all in all, like that's the way change happens, right? You start from appreciating that it needs to happen, and then you go from there. So I guess you can take the glass half full or glass half empty a little bit here, but. Cool. So to read up the full Docker security report, check it out also on the Snyk website. Before I let you go, I like to ask every guest that comes on the show if they have one sort of security pet peeve or security tip, bit of security advice for a team looking to level up their security. What would that be?
I think mine would be try to leverage, coach someone from the team to be a security champion, and really empower them to take actions on that. So I found that, previous experience leading teams, I found that very helpful and impactful to have, someone from the R&D team, owning security, loving it, and, trying to help the rest of developers through doing a lot of AppSec work through the teams.
Cool. Yeah, that's I think security champions is a really good theme. It's been mentioned many times on the show. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and join us for the next one. That's all we have time for today. If you'd like to come on as a guest on this show or get involved in this community, find us at thesecuredeveloper.com or on Twitter @thesecuredev. Visit heavybit.com to find additional episodes, full transcriptions, and other great podcasts. See you next time.